Remember Christmas? Wasn't always great getting gifts? And if you were anything like me, didn't you want to go looking for your gift before Christmas? You'd search through the house looking for that present, and when you find it, depending on how clever they were with wrapping and you couldn't peel it back, what did you do? You took it and you shook it. And to this day, you remember the sound of socks. Isn't that the worst thing, crushing the hopes and dreams of a 12-year-old to get socks for Christmas? But that's how it is with gifts. And as we start getting a little bit older, as awesome as it is to get gifts, you start realizing that you've got a desire in you, a restlessness in you, that you don't just want to get gifts, you start wanting to give them. When you start really listening to your heart, you notice that the kind of gifts that you're giving become less about what something is and more about how much you give yourself. I remember when I was getting married, the years leading up to that wedding day, I stopped giving my wife just presents, trying to impress her. The presents were more about me, and that's really what she wanted. The gifts become more about how much you invest yourself in the gift that you give. And that's the beauty of this. When you look at your hearts and you look at the restlessness that we have, the best gifts that you ever got and the best gifts that you ever gave, the best gifts in general are ourselves. And if this is true with us, how much more true with God? And if God is the giver of good gifts, and if he's good, the best gift he can give us is himself. And so the real question for a seeker is, are you ready not just to receive from God everything, but are you ready to give him back the only thing that you can, yourself? Father Dan, thank you so much for joining us. Were you one of those kids who always knew that he wanted to be a priest?
No, definitely not. I've heard a lot of stories from priests who they knew when they were 5 years old, which is remarkable. It's great. You know, when I was 5, I was in the backyard playing with a toy machine gun. I was saving the world, but kind of in a different way. The priesthood was the furthest thing from my mind when I was young. My dad was a helicopter pilot in the Army for 41 years. His dad was in World War II, and my mom's dad was in World War II. All of that had a profound effect on me, and I wanted to be a soldier from a young age.
Sounds like you were kind of an action junkie from childhood. So tell me, how did Christ fit into this?
Oh, Christ was always at the center of our family. My parents both, they knew Jesus, and they prayed and they read the Bible, and I could tell from a young age that that was real. And so my faith was always very real. You know, going to Sunday Mass, though it was boring, it had an effect. And reading the Bible, although I didn't always understand it, it had an effect in the long run. So I always knew that God had a plan for my life.
And so how did that effect kind of show itself in high school?
My family, we not only went to Mass on Sundays, but we also were part of this ecumenical charismatic prayer group. So we'd go to Mass on Sunday morning, which was always really boring for me. And then we'd go to the prayer meeting on Sunday afternoon, which I hated because that meant you couldn't watch football. But once I got there, the worship was more dynamic, it was more lively, it engaged me, and there was this sense of total commitment and giving everything of my life to him. And that was prominent in our family. That's a big reason why it was real for us. But also in high school, I went to this evangelical kind of non-denominational high school. And that is where I heard about all these people who, William Wilberforce was one, the guy who spearheaded the end of slavery in the British territories in the 1800s. Hearing about him really inspired me, and I had a teacher who would talk a lot about, you're meant to be men and women for others. And you know, what is Christ going to call you to do? You're going to do great things. What are those great things going to be? So I thought, wow, what are those going to be? And that was always a question for me.
I think a lot of high schoolers are struggling with finding something that's passionate enough to be worth pursuing. So for you entering to high school, knowing Jesus, being challenged by teachers, how did that manifest in your friends, in the life? Were you involved in sports? Did you find yourself dating?
Actually, the community, the prayer group, the Sunday evening prayer group that my family is part of, the Work of Christ community, there's this commitment that's an optional thing for high schoolers to opt out of dating for a year. And I made that all 4 years in high school, mostly because the girls that I was interested in were not interested in me. I was not that popular in high school. But also, I thought, you know, this is probably a good thing, and dating is probably a distraction for me.
That seems radically different from what most people would think. For a lot of people, hearing that you were opting out of relationships assume that at that point you were already a priest, or that you knew you were going to be a priest.
Far from it. I thought, well, Mass was boring. Going to church was boring, so I thought being a priest would be awful.
At what point did you find yourself seeking after the Lord in a way that led you to where you're at now?
Well, I think it started when I was a senior in high school. I began to pray every day, pretty much every day, about where God wanted me to go to college. I had been going through the application process for the Air Force Academy, but had been led away from that. This is not the direction that God is really calling me to go in. And I began to pray about, well, what is the direction? Like, what is His plan? And just for some inexplicable reason, I began to want to go to Ave Maria College, which I visited, and it was really small, and I thought, no way am I going to this school. But it was just the daily prayer of wanting to know, what is God's plan? I didn't know that God wanted me to know it. I thought He was kind of like holding it back from me. Like if you pray really hard, if you beat it out of me, maybe I'll show you my plan. But that daily prayer, that perseverance in prayer, eventually it paid off, and I ended up having a lot of peace. I didn't know why, but I had a lot of peace about the college that I chose.
How did He show His plan to you? How did you know that you were called into the priesthood?
In high school, my youth group was led by these men called the Servants of the Word. They planted in my mind the idea that maybe I would be called to celibacy. Maybe that's how God would ask me to lay down my life for Him and to serve Him. And so I entered college thinking about, praying about, yeah, maybe I am called to celibacy. That sounds like a really good thing. God could use me so much more if I was just serving Him. And I had read Jesus' words in Matthew 19, you know, some have given up marriage for the sake of the kingdom of God. Let anyone accept this who can. And I thought, I can. And then I met this wonderful, beautiful, way out of my league, gorgeous Catholic woman at college, and suddenly celibacy did not seem so attractive to me.
Yeah, it seems interesting. You want to make yourself a gift for God, and then suddenly it seems like He just gave you a gift instead.
Yeah, and that was a really big question. I thought, well, Lord, do you want me to be celibate, or are you putting this woman in my life because this is who I was made for? And then I realized that I had fallen for this woman, which was perfectly explainable. She's beautiful, she loved Jesus, she knew her faith. She's the best Catholic at the time that I had ever met.
And what did she feel for you?
Well, I don't really know how, but she fell for me too. Actually, I do know how. It's explainable because of a lack of options. There was a 3-to-1 girl-to-guy ratio at Ave Maria at the time, so the odds were in my favor. That doesn't really explain all of it, but we very much fell for each other, and at first I thought, wow, this is amazing. I can't believe that somebody like this would have the same feelings toward me as I have for her.
Did you guys enter into a process of discernment? Because that seems like a beautiful vocation that God could have been calling you to. So how did you know?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think she was always frustrated by the fact that I didn't know what was my vocation. I was discerning this, and so when I met her and when our relationship, it sort of took on a life of its own, and yet I didn't know, is this God's will? And as I prayed more and more, I had the awful feeling, and it was awful at first, that no, God, He's calling me to celibacy. This relationship is actually, it's not His first choice for me, and that became a terrifying thought as a 20-year-old.
And so did you find yourself running to God or running from God?
Well, at first I said all the right things. God, I want to be all yours. I just want to do your will. I want to give everything for you. The prayers I had prayed since I was a kid. And I didn't really mean them. I wanted to mean them, but I didn't. The subtext was always, can I just have your permission to marry her? I eventually lost, my courage eventually failed. And I found myself running away from God. I'm not happy. All of my family and friends can see it. Everyone who knew me could see it. And God, I don't think you're giving me the grace to be celibate. This is not a life-giving future for me. So I'm going to go ahead and and make the decision that you're calling me to the vocation of marriage. And I told everybody, but I think deep down I always knew. I knew that I was being a coward and running away from God. I really did begin to push his voice out. I didn't want to hear his voice. I didn't want to know his plan. I just wanted him to be okay with my plan. That actually became a really painful experience for me.
Like the story of the rich young man in the Bible who lived faithfully and followed the law. There was a man named Damien who God invited to give up everything and come follow him. And unlike the rich young man who felt like he had too many possessions to just give up and follow God, he had too many gifts that it was hard for him to choose the giver of gifts over the gifts themselves. Saint Damien, however, chose that as an opportunity, not just to follow God, but to make himself a gift to the God who's given him everything. Damien went to the island of Molokai and spent his life serving those who felt they had no worth or dignity. And in doing so, he gave up his life so that they might know the value of theirs. So what do we do when God invites us to give up everything? What path do we take? Get back to the story of Dan and the moment where God invites him to give everything completely to him. What path will he take?
Did you like the program you just watched? Help Shalom World bring more programs like this to a global audience. Your support helps us share the peace of Christ with the world. Visit shalomworld.org/donate.
If we're all children of God already, why do we need a relationship with Jesus? Now that's a great question, so let's seek the answer together. Well, first of all, let's tackle the first part. Are we all children of God? The answer might surprise you. It's no. See, to be a child of someone implies that we share the same nature as whoever our Father is. Now, I'm pretty sure you've noticed that God, well, He's God, and we're not. And since we don't share that same nature with God, our natural relationship with Him isn't children to their Father, but creation to its good and faithful Creator. But here's the awesome thing. God creates in us this desire and then reveals to us His desire for us to become His children. But this isn't something that we can make happen. It's not something we're born into. It's not even in our power because it's, well, beyond nature. And this is why we call it supernatural. And surprise, this is what the Bible is about. That our Creator is a seeker and what He's seeking is to satisfy our deepest desire. When God finds us, He invites us into a deeper relationship with Him through a series of covenants. Now, covenants in the Old Testament are part of this process that creates new relationships with people who are otherwise not related. Now, contracts can bring people together too. Unlike a covenantal relationship, a contractual relationship is less about creating family and more about upholding bargains. We make promises based on services exchanged. For example, I promise to pay you money if you mow my lawn. But if you don't mow my lawn, you've broken your end of the contract, and I can break mine and not pay you. And thank goodness that's not the relationship God wants with us. Covenants are more and better. Covenants create family relationships through an exchange of persons. Covenants unite us together in intimacy and not just, well, legality. And this is exactly why we need Jesus. God the Father wants us to really be like His only begotten Son, Jesus. And He does this by giving Jesus to us so that we can give ourselves back to Him. And in doing so, we become family. Jesus is the only reason we can call God our Father. Think about it. When you or I call someone Father, we usually mean that guy with a beard who enjoys watching football and kind of shaping you into being something more than a video gamer the rest of your life. And this guy by nature is your dad, and you have every right to call him Father because you're his child. And without Jesus, we simply couldn't call God Father any more than your friends can call your dad theirs. But with Jesus, and in Jesus and through Jesus, we're invited to share in His sonship and receive everything His Father wants to give us. And the sacrament of baptism is where we receive this grace to call out to His Father as ours. And it's here in the church that we get to learn how to be loved by our Father and learn how to love all our new siblings. Hey, this is why we need Jesus, and this is what it means to be a Christian. Saying yes to the covenant means we get to receive and share the gift of God's love as part of a new worldwide family that we call the Catholic Church. So welcome home.
Trying to not listen to Jesus, it seems like he's got to break his way into your life. So what happened?
Yeah, I was miserable. He did have to break in because I was pushing him out, and I think I only lasted for a couple of months maybe, but it was the most miserable couple months of my life because I knew that I was choosing to limit my yes to Jesus. It was like his arms are stretched out on the cross, like, I love you this much. And I was saying, I love you this much. Or maybe, okay, here, but like, don't make me give you everything. And one day, God really broke in when I was sitting in class and Dr. Janet Smith was talking about, in bioethics, was talking about Saint Damien of Molokai, how he gave his life to serve and love the lepers on Molokai, and how he was a man for others, and how we're all meant to live for others, and until we do, we're really not free and we're really not going to be happy. And that just stuck with me. I'm not free, I'm not going to be happy. And the Lord really used that, and he worked on my heart.
Now you find yourself, going back to the Lord with celibacy?
I would not be happy until I fully said yes to Jesus in the way that he's asking me to, on his terms. I really wouldn't be free. I would have this sadness of saying, I only love you this much. And so I went home, and I remember going back into the woods behind my parents' house and praying the first honest prayer of surrender to Jesus, maybe ever, but the first honest prayer about my vocation. And I just said, Jesus, I will follow you. I will, break up with this, this woman. I will follow you wherever we're going. And in that moment, so much peace and so much freedom and so much joy flooded into my heart. And I was crying, and it was amazing. And the thing is, it was still real 2 months and 3 months and 3 years later.
When you said yes to God, obviously you had to say no to her. How did that go?
I didn't tell her at first that I had kind of changed my mind about what my vocation was, and I waited a long time to do that. It was a hard conversation for me. It was really hard for her at first, but I think she wanted to help me follow Jesus. She didn't want to get in the way of maybe what the Lord was calling me to do. But even in the midst of, I guess, breaking up, there was still joy and there was still peace in that.
Yeah, well, great confirmation. That was the right decision.
And that's so unnatural. Like, I am 21-year-old guy breaking up with this woman that I'm in love with, but that's the thing about celibacy, is that it's not natural. It's supernatural. And there's this joy. It wasn't a sense of, oh, wow, I guess I have to be celibate because the church makes me be celibate.
Where are you today?
Today, I'm the chaplain of Powers Catholic High School in Flint, and I love being a priest. And the sense of joy at saying yes to Jesus and saying, like, with arms wide open, I'm all yours. There's no like asterisks here. It's freedom. It's really freedom to say yes to someone that you love, and it's freedom to say yes to Jesus because our hearts were made for him. I never thought being a priest would be this good. It's not boring, actually, which was a bit of a surprise to me at first. And I wouldn't trade it for anything.
God seems like he's offered you so many gifts, and now you've made yourself a gift back to him. And one of those gifts, I'm sure, to students is this kind of spiritual fatherhood you have. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yes, that was the biggest surprise of the priesthood, was that spiritual fatherhood is a real thing. It changed me. And when I got to Powers Catholic High School, all of a sudden, I love these students like they belong to me in a way. Not like I'm their parents, they have parents, but that spiritual fathers do have a responsibility to pray and to sacrifice for the people that are entrusted to them. And there is a sense of pride and there is a sense of love there that defies human explanation.
If you were to speak to your students over at the school, or even to anyone really looking, what would you say to them about really just searching and following Christ?
To have the courage to surrender to Him and have the courage to give up what He's asking you to give up or take on what He's asking you to take on. It takes grace. I couldn't do it on my own strength, but then when the Holy Spirit gave me the strength and when He gave me joy and life in that, it's better than I can make it sound, I guess, is what I would say. A life following Jesus, totally given over to Him, is the best life possible.
Are we really listening to our hearts? If we really spend time listening to what our hearts are saying, do we recognize the restlessness? Do we see that restlessness as a compass pointing us in a direction? And are we willing to follow? For a lot of us, when we see that God is inviting us to give up everything, it almost seems like He wants to break our hearts. But He's only doing that really because our hearts aren't big enough for the desire He wants to give us. So sometimes it requires us to be emptied so that He can fill us with something even greater. And for Dan, for all of us, the invitation is there. Do we recognize our restless hearts? And do we recognize the one who created our hearts and promises that if we find Him, we finally find rest? So remember, seek and you shall find.
For all the thirsty in need of the river, for all those sleeping hearts waking from the slumber, for everyone still standing at the shoreline, come. For all the hurting running from their healer, for all the skeptics running from an answer, let everyone who hears these words say, come. For the Spirit and the bride say, come. Yeah, the Spirit and the bride say, come.
For all the Pharisees empty on the inside, for all the lovers who spent their love on a lie, for the forgotten, the Father's heart says, come.
For all the fatherless looking for approval, for all the daughters who never they're beautiful, let everyone who hears these words say, come. Yeah, the Spirit and the bride say, come. Yeah, the Spirit and the bride say, come. For the Spirit and the bride say, come. Yeah, the Spirit and the bride say, come. Amen, amen. Come, Lord Jesus, come again. Oh, until then, grace and peace be ours. Amen, amen, amen. Come, Lord Jesus, come again. Until then, grace and peace be ours. Amen. Till you come again, peace be ours. Amen. Till you come again, till you come again. For the Spirit and the bride say, come. Yeah, the Spirit and the bride say, come. Yeah, the Spirit and the bride say, come. Say, come.